Today's short lecture is just going to be an overview of some of the Westward Expansion big hits, and then I'm going to come back around in subsequent lectures and dig into a lot more detail on exactly how these events transpired. I want to start with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, and we talked about this a little bit with the Jefferson lecture, but it is important to recognize that this was really one of the first times in world history that an empire changed hands, not by battle, but by agreement. The Louisiana Purchase, which was ultimately concluded in a quiet diplomatic exchange between the American and French emissaries. France, under this time, is under the complete control of Napoleon Bonaparte, added over 828,000 square miles to the United States. It more than doubled the size of what was then America. And there was no clear authority in the Constitution for Jefferson, who was president at this time, to actually go ahead and make this purchase. Still, Jefferson reasoned that, at least in this one instance, we had to be pragmatic. The opportunity to double the size of the United States for only $15 million was well worth it. And so in 1803, we went ahead and purchased a vast swath of territory from France, who simply concluded that they no longer needed it, or I suppose it should be proper to say Napoleon concluded he no longer needed it after losing essentially the Haitian Revolution and the sugar factory that was Haiti. But then again, like I said, I'll get into that a little bit more in a future episode. But then, of course, the question was, well, we just doubled the size of the United States. What did we get? And honestly, nobody knew. And so, to answer that question, Jefferson dispatched Meriwether Lewis and William Clark in 1804 with a small corps of men, and they were charged simply with to do a couple of things: map the rivers, hopefully find a water passage all the way from the Mississippi to the Pacific Ocean. Spoiler alert, there isn't one because of this thing called the Rocky Mountains. They didn't know that at the time. Establish trade, and of course, claim possession as much as you possibly can. This was a long expedition. It lasted 2 full years. It was a careful blend of interesting enlightenment, curiosity, and imperial ambition. The two men cataloged hundreds of species, navigated mountain passes, and made contact with more than 50 native tribes whose complex societies had long predated this notion of quote unquote discovery. While their official instructions emphasized peace, the underlying message to everyone that they spoke to was clear: America was coming, the expansion was beginning, it was inevitable. In the years that followed, settlers followed these rumors, dreams, rivers into the western interior. They became hunters, trappers, missionaries, and speculators. Some sought land, others sought God, but they all brought with them European tensions, ideas, cultures, and politics. Now, of course, during the same time, we weren't just expanding westward, we were expanding to the south and east. And as I mentioned in previous episodes, this was when Andrew Jackson, future President Andrew Jackson, led expeditions into Florida in an effort to try to punish Native American bands that were residing there, this Florida being under the control of Spain at the time, also to try to get runaway slaves and also to punish criminals. Eventually, all of these cross border raids culminated in what could have easily been a war, but again, it turned out not to result in bloodshed, but another diplomatic bargain. And in the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1809, Florida was ceded to the United States from Spain, which established a firm southern border for the United States. Now, of course, as all this was going on before, I've already talked about in the previous episode how tensions over slavery were beginning to develop, and this will be a theme that we come back to time and time again. The Missouri Compromise was necessary to allow Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state, bringing in Maine at the same token. And while the Missouri Compromise would establish the 3036 parallel as the southern boundary below which slavery was allowed and above which it would not be, that was a temporary fix at best, as we will see. Yet, westward expansion was never simply a question of lines drawn on a map. It was also a story of forced immigration, broken treaties, and a redefinition of what it meant to be home. Nowhere was this clearer than in the Southeast, where the so called five civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, found themselves under siege from settlers eager for cotton lands. Despite efforts by these tribes to adopt American farming practices, legal systems, and even Christianity, the hunger for land outweighed any respect for adaptation. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed into law by President Andrew Jackson, authorized the federal government to negotiate the removal of native tribes to lands west of the Mississippi. In practice, there was no negotiation here. This was coercion. Over the next decade, tens of thousands of Native Americans were forcibly relocated along what became known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands died from disease, exposure, and starvation. The act opened up vast swaths of land for white settlement and accelerated the push west, but of course, at devastating costs. Now, where we're going to leave it today is with Texas. As Indian nations were driven westward, American settlers turned their gaze to Texas, then a Mexican province, thinly settled and far from Mexico City's effective control. Mexico had actually invited Anglo American settlers under generous land grant terms, hoping to populate and defend the region. But cultural rifts emerged quickly, especially over the issue of slavery, which Mexico had already outlawed. By the mid 1830s, tensions erupted into full scale rebellion. At the Battle of the Alamo in 1836, nearly 200 Texan defenders were killed by Mexican forces under General Santa Anna. The loss became a rallying cry, and soon afterwards, the Texans, under Sam Houston, won independence at the Battle of San Jacinto. The Republic of Texas would then stand alone for nearly a decade, seeking annexation to the United States. But annexation posed risks. Mexico had never recognized Texas's independence and warned that any move to join the U.S. would be an act of war. President Van Buren would defer. President Tyler would hint at annexation. But it wasn't until James K. Polk took office in 1845 as a full throated champion of expansion that Texas was admitted to the Union and war with Mexico became inevitable.